Welcome to Whispers of the Past, where forgotten tales return to life. In the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, a city where cobblestone streets carried the weight of history and the church bells rang with the rhythm of tradition, lived Sister Margaret. She was not a figure easily forgotten. With her round frame, soft cheeks, and warm brown eyes that always seemed to shine with compassion, she had become a familiar presence in the town. Children who roamed the streets knew her by name. The homeless men and women who sought shelter at the convent recognized her gentle voice long before they saw her face. For decades, she had been a living symbol of charity, of patience, of quiet devotion. But the truth that most people ignored, or sometimes even ridiculed in cruel whispers, was her size. Sister Margaret was obese. Her health condition mixed with a lifetime of emotional scars and a body that never seemed to listen to her efforts, had left her with a frame that attracted both pity and mockery. She had grown used to the stares, the comments that cut deep but were delivered with a smile, the laughter that followed her down streets when she thought no one was listening. Yet, she endured it all with silence, convinced that God's love was stronger than human cruelty, and that her service to the world was greater than the pain she carried in her body. The convent where she lived was an old, beautiful building, a structure that had stood for over a century. Its walls carried the voices of generations of nuns who had come before her, women who had chosen lives of sacrifice, simplicity, and prayer. But in modern times, the convent had become a shadow of its former self. Donations were smaller, fewer young women were joining, and the cost of maintaining the historic building had grown overwhelming. Cracks appeared in the walls, leaks dripped from the roof during storms, and the burden of debt hung heavily over the small community of sisters who remained. One summer the town gathered in the square for what was supposed to be a noble cause. The convent leaders, guided by the advice of local benefactors, had agreed to host a charity event that would raise funds to save the building. The plan was simple. The nuns would be auctioned for a day of service. The highest bidder would receive the nun's time, whether it was teaching a child, helping in a kitchen, sewing, or offering prayer and comfort. It was marketed as wholesome, entertaining, and selfless. At least, that was the promise. The evening of the event came. The air was warm and humid, with a golden sunset painting the horizon. A stage had been erected in the town square, draped with banners and decorated with flowers. Families gathered. Businessmen attended in polished suits, and curious townsfolk filled the seats, eager to witness what they believed would be a charming evening. The mayor gave a speech about tradition and community, and the auctioneer, with his booming voice, invited the first nun on stage. One by one, the sisters stepped forward. Some were bid on with excitement, people laughing and shouting numbers as though they were buying a prize at a fair. A young nun skilled in baking received high bids from families who wanted her to bake bread for them. Another, who was known for her music, was offered large sums by a wealthy man who wanted her to teach his children piano. Each bid was met with cheers, claps, and joyful applause. Then came Sister Margaret's turn. She stepped slowly onto the stage, her heart pounding beneath her habit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to appear calm. Though inside she felt the weight of eyes pressing against her. The laughter began even before the auctioneer spoke. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a cruel symphony of whispers and chuckles. Some men elbowed each other, pointing at her size. A group of teenagers snickered, their voices rising above the hum of the crowd. She heard one of them mock, "They'll have to pay double just to feed her." Another laughed, "Who'd want her in their house? She'll eat them out of it." The auctioneer tried to maintain composure, his smile faltering as he raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have Sister Margaret, known for her kindness, her service to the poor, and her dedication to teaching, who will start the bidding at $50. The silence was deafening. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The crowd grew restless. Some laughed, others shook their heads, and whispers spread like wildfire. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously, lowering the price. $40, $30, $20. Still no hands were raised. Sister Margaret's heart sank. The stage felt like a prison, and she was the prisoner being mocked by the very people she had served for years. Finally, breaking the silence, a voice rose from the crowd. It was a wealthy businessman, a man known not for his generosity, but for his arrogance and cruelty. With a smirk, he raised his hand. $10, he called out. His words were not filled with kindness, but with mockery. He laughed as he added, "I'll take her, just to see if she can actually work. Maybe she can carry a tray if it doesn't break under her weight." The crowd erupted in laughter. Some clapped, others roared with amusement. The auctioneer, desperate to keep the event moving, slammed his gavel. "Sold," he shouted. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder in Margaret's heart. She forced a smile, bowing her head slightly as though humbled by the moment, but her soul was breaking. For decades, she had served with devotion, feeding the hungry, teaching children, caring for the sick, and praying daily for those who scorned her. But in this moment, standing on that stage, she no longer felt like a servant of God. She felt like an object, a joke, a thing to be bought and laughed at. When she stepped down from the stage, her hands trembled. She did not see the colorful banners or hear the cheerful music playing in the square. All she heard was the laughter ringing in her ears, sharp and cruel, and all she felt was the crushing weight of humiliation pressing on her chest. For the first time in her life, Sister Margaret felt her faith falter. That night, back in her small room at the convent, she sat at her desk with a candle burning low. The flame flickered as she stared at the wooden cross hanging on the wall. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered a prayer, though it came out broken, fragmented, more like a cry than a plea. "Why, Lord?" she asked. "Why did you let them laugh? Why did you let me stand there like a fool sold for mockery?" Her words dissolved into sobs, her hands covering her face as the weight of the day crushed her spirit. Sleep did not come easily. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamt of the crowd's laughter, of pointing fingers, of the gavel striking down to mark her worth as $10. She woke before dawn, her pillow damp with tears. The sun had not yet risen, and the convent halls were quiet, but inside her a storm raged. For the first time in years, she questioned her path, her calling, and even her faith in the God she had served so faithfully. The chapel was quiet that morning, its silence broken only by the soft creak of the wooden door as Sister Margaret stepped inside. The first rays of dawn filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the walls with hues of crimson and gold. She clutched her rosary beads, their familiar smoothness bringing little comfort to the turmoil inside her. Every step echoed in the stillness, amplifying her sense of isolation. She lowered herself into a pew, the wood cool beneath her, and bowed her head. Her lips trembled as she began to pray, but her voice broke into a whisper. "Lord, I do not understand. I have given my life to you. I have served where others turned away. I have carried burdens with a smile. I have loved even those who mocked me. Yet yesterday, in front of all, I was humiliated. I was laughed at, treated as a thing, not a person. Have I been blind all these years? Have I misunderstood your call?" Her words dissolved into sobs, her shoulders shaking under the weight of despair. For the first time, she felt that the faith which had carried her through storms was slipping away like sand between her fingers. The chapel, once her refuge, felt hollow. The crucifix above the altar stared down in silence, and the flickering candlelight seemed like a weak reminder of a presence she no longer felt. As she sat there, lost in grief, the sound of small footsteps approached. She lifted her head slowly and saw a little girl standing near the aisle. The child could not have been more than 8 years old, her dress faded but clean, her eyes wide with innocence. In her hands she held a basket of wildflowers, their colors vibrant against the dimness of the chapel. She walked timidly to Sister Margaret and placed the basket on the pew beside her. "My mama said you helped us when we had nothing," the girl said softly. "She said you brought us food and prayed for us when she was sick. We love you, sister. Please don't be sad." For a moment, Margaret could not speak. Her tears returned, but this time they flowed differently, less from pain, more from the shock of grace. She looked at the child, at the sincerity shining in her young eyes, and felt something stir in her heart. The laughter of the crowd was still fresh in her memory, but this child's voice cut through it like light piercing the dark. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently touched the girl's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't know how much this means." The girl smiled, nodded, and skipped away, leaving the basket of flowers behind. Margaret stared at it for a long time. It was simple, wildflowers gathered from a field. But to her it felt like a message, not from the child but from God, a reminder that faith was not about applause or recognition, nor about being free from suffering. It was about love, quiet, often unseen, but powerful enough to transform despair into strength. That moment became a turning point. Though her heart was still heavy, Margaret realized that her worth was not measured by the mockery of others, nor by the price called out at an auction. Her worth was in the lives she touched, in the kindness she gave when no one else cared, in the prayers whispered in silence for those who never even knew her name. Yet, the struggle did not vanish overnight. The days that followed were difficult. The townspeople continued to whisper when she passed, some still laughing about the auction. As if it were a harmless joke, Margaret carried those wounds quietly, but each time she felt her spirit sinking, she remembered the little girl's voice and the basket of flowers. It was enough to keep her moving. One step at a time, she began to see the event not only as humiliation, but as a test, a fire through which her faith had to walk. If she could endure this, perhaps her service would be stronger, her heart more compassionate. She thought often of the businessman who had mocked her, wondering what emptiness drove him to cruelty. Instead of anger, she began to pray for him. It was not easy. Sometimes the bitterness rose again, but she forced herself to kneel and whisper his name in prayer. Over time, she found that bitterness loosening its grip. Her sisters in the convent noticed the change. One evening, another nun asked quietly, "Margaret, how do you still smile after what happened?" "I would have left if it were me." Margaret simply replied, "Because if I let their laughter define me, I would no longer belong to God. I would belong to their cruelty. I cannot let that happen." A month passed, and the convent's financial troubles worsened. The auction had raised money, but not enough to save the building. Donors turned away, seeing the convent as a relic of the past. Sister Margaret, despite her wounds, became the voice of encouragement among the nuns. "We are not walls and roofs," she told them. "We are service. If this place falls, then we will serve elsewhere. Faith is not tied to stone. It is tied to hearts." Her words carried weight, for they came from someone who had walked through humiliation and yet chosen to rise. Slowly, the community began to see her differently. Some townspeople who once mocked her approached her with apologies, others with requests for prayers. The little girl who had given her flowers often returned with her mother, bringing bread or small gifts, insisting it was repayment for kindness Margaret had once shown them. And yet, the scars of that night never fully disappeared. Late at night, when the convent was still, Margaret sometimes sat alone and remembered the laughter. It haunted her, a ghost of pain that clung stubbornly. But alongside it was another memory. The wildflowers, the child's soft voice, the reminder that even in mockery, there could be love. Those two memories lived side by side in her heart, one of cruelty, the other of grace. Perhaps she thought that was the balance of life. Years later, long after the convent had closed and the nuns had dispersed to other missions, people in Charleston still remembered Sister Margaret. Some remembered her for her size, the laughter, the cruel jokes. But many more remembered her for her compassion, her prayers, her refusal to let humiliation destroy her calling. Stories spread of the nun who had been mocked and sold, yet had continued to serve with love. She became, in her quiet way, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that faith is not tested in comfort but in fire. As she grew older, Margaret often reflected on that season of her life. She realized that questioning her faith had not been a failure, but part of the journey. Faith, she came to understand, was not the absence of doubt. It was the choice to keep walking even when doubt tried to chain her to the ground. The auction had nearly broken her, But it had also refined her, stripping away pride and teaching her to see God not in the approval of crowds, but in the small gestures of love that often went unnoticed. On her final days, as she lay in her bed surrounded by the sisters who cared for her, she whispered the same words she had once prayed through tears. "Why, Lord?" But this time her voice was not heavy with despair. It was filled with gratitude. "Why did you give me so much love, when I deserved so little?" The answer came not in words, but in the faces around her, in the quiet memories of children she had helped, families she had fed, prayers she had whispered. She closed her eyes with peace, her story not one of mockery, but of grace. And in the city of Charleston, where laughter had once humiliated her, people remembered her not as a spectacle, but as a saint in her own right. A woman who had questioned her faith, only to find it stronger than ever,